just called Jesus. And so today is Palm Sunday, as Derek has mentioned. And if you look at the title of the message today, Cheers, Jeers, and Tears. See, for the most part, when we talk about the triumphal entry, all we ever talk about are the cheers. But folks, I got to tell you, there's a whole lot more going on that day than just cheering. And we're going to look at that this morning. And I just want to start out by saying, very simply, everyone loves a parade, right? Isn't that a saying that we use, that everybody loves a parade? Yeah, I like parades. You like parades? When Joan and I were living over near Orrville, Ohio, her family would gather every 4th of July or around that date because they kept moving it. But there would be a parade in that little town that was just incredible. So we love the parade because we wanted to steal the kids' candy once they collected it. And let's face it, most parades are celebrations. Right? The Rose Bowl parade or the Rose Parade on New Year's Day. That's a wonderful parade. My dad actually went out and bought a color TV so we could see the Rose Parade in color. Isn't that amazing? And then there's Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. And we're familiar with that. One that you may not be familiar with, which is actually the 3rd largest parade in the country, and that's the Hall of Fame Parade in Canton, Ohio. Never heard of it until I moved there. But I had the chance to go to that parade a few times. And see, those are 3 very large annual parades, and they have specific things they want to celebrate. But I want to tell you, parades have been around a long time. The oldest parade on record is in 1762, and it was New York City St. Patrick's Day Parade. Of all things, turning things green. Think about that. But then, some of you may be old enough to remember this one, but I'm not quite there. But October 29th, 1927. Some of you there? No. There's another parade in New York City, and it welcomed Charles Lindbergh back after he had his first cross-Atlantic flight. And I'm going to tell you what, there were 750,000 pounds of ticker tape that covered the streets. Can you fathom that? That's a lot of cleanup after a parade. But then on March 1st, 1962, there was a bigger one. 3,474 tons of confetti were thrown on the streets in a 7-mile stretch when they welcomed John Glenn back after his first orbital flight around the Earth. Who wants to be on that cleanup crew? Think about all the stuff that was thrown around. Now, there's another parade that is not one that we want to think about and celebrate, but that was a parade that went down Pennsylvania Avenue. And that was the procession of President Kennedy's funeral. Many of you remember that. The horse-drawn caisson, followed by a rider on a horse. It left an everlasting impression, but even more so was the young mother and the 2 small children that followed close behind. But no one covering that event called it a parade. But in a sense, it was a parade. It was just not a celebratory parade, because there was a great deal of sadness. Well, today we're going to look at a parade. It's another kind of parade, if you will. See, it was a parade that began Jesus' last week on this earth. We call it the triumphal entry, Palm Sunday. It marks this event. But this was a parade of a very different kind. See, this began the very last week of Jesus' life here on earth. How important is that last week of Jesus' life? Well, the Bible shares some importance with us, and I don't think that sometimes we realize this, but in these events, listen, Matthew devotes 8 of his 28 chapters just to the last week of Jesus' life. 8 chapters of his 28. Mark, he devotes 6 of his 16 chapters just to the last week. Luke, he gives us 6 of 24 chapters for the last week. John uses almost half his gospel to tell the story of the last week of Jesus' life. And it's so important that we even give it a name. We call it the Passion Week. It's the Passion Week. See, the first day of Jesus' last week was a day of a whole lot of mixed emotions. There were cheers, there were jeers, and there were tears. And we cannot understand this parade unless we understand all 3 of those things that took place. You see, as we trace the events of Jesus last week, as we do that today, I'm hoping that you and I will become more convinced that these events matter greatly to you and I today. They weren't just for people 2,000 years ago, they were for us today as well. They changed history. Think about what took place that week. But not only did they change history, they can and will, if we allow it, to change our lives. And that's what I want to focus on today. Because these events that we talk about with this parade are more about than just 2,000 years ago. See, they're about you and me. Peter sums it up when he writes this. He says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God." To bring you to God. To bring you to God. That is the purpose of this last week of Jesus' life, was to bring us to God. You know, a couple weeks ago, we spoke about the Monday of that last week when Jesus went to the temple. He was fired up, and we talked about what makes Jesus mad. And then we jumped from Monday to Thursday when we talked about how Jesus was actually focused in the Passover meal. And we looked at how that was. And so today we're going to go back before these 2 events in movie technology. We're going to do a prequel. We're going back before those 2 to see how it all began. We refer to this again as a triumphal entry. And on the surface, let's say, on the surface, it certainly looks like a welcoming party for a victorious hero. That's what it looks like. But can I just share with you that not everybody was happy about this? That first day of Jesus last week was a day of mixed emotions. There were cheers, jeers, and tears. And we need to understand all 3. So let's start with the cheers. Let's start with the happy. You like to be happy this morning? There's a lot of happiness of this day. There really was. You see, Jerusalem at this time, on this day, was already crowded for the Passover feast. There are probably more than 100,000 people in Jerusalem. I'm going to guess that is about 6 times the normal population. And Passover was the biggest event of the Jewish faith because it marked the deliverance of the Hebrew people as they left Egypt and they marched to the promised land. But this Passover was different. Jesus was in town. For 3 years, Jesus had traveled across Israel teaching and performing amazing miracles. He had been in Jerusalem before, but this time, it's different. He knew it was different. He had been telling his disciples that something big was about to happen. And that word about something big going to happen, that word spread all over town. And expectations of this event were at fever pitch. The text we're going to use this morning is found in Matthew 21, verses 1 to 3. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethpage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and once you will find a donkey tied there, and with her colt. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away. That sounds so strange to me. We're getting ready to walk into Jerusalem. We're up on this hill, and we're looking down, and Jesus looks at a couple of the guys, and he says, hey, I need you to go do this. Why in the world? We've walked all this way, so why now, all of a sudden, do you need this donkey and her colt? What's the reason for that? This procession began as Jesus and his group of ragtag people crested a hill that was called the Mount of Olives. And that was just east of the city of Jerusalem. The hilltop stood 200 feet above the temple that was there in the capital city. And the road kind of snaked its way down the hill and through the olive groves, and it headed directly into the east gate of the city. And so this is where the crowd started to gather. They gathered along this route. They began to lay their coats and their palm branches across the path, rolling out their version of the proverbial red carpet. Cheers rang out. Hosanna, they cried, which means Jehovah, save us. That cry and the song, there's a song here that says this: blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. That's from Psalm 118:26. Others shouted out, peace in heaven and glory in the highest. How fitting are those words that are almost identical to the angel's song when Jesus was born. Hasn't changed much, has it? He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And it's not ironic that these words would bring in his final week as he came to the city. So let's just ask, why would people cheer? Well, I suppose there were lots of reasons. I think some were just curious. You ever been curious about something and you just walked out to see what was going on and you get caught up in that mob mentality? I love the commercials on TV, and I can't remember the product, but it's where this guy's trying to keep these people from becoming their mom and dad. You know what I'm talking about, where they're standing there and they're looking in this manhole where these guys are working and they're telling them what they need to do and all that. Listen, that to me is what we're dealing with here. They just came along and started to help out. And that's what happened when Jesus is coming into town. There are people who have no idea what's going on, but they see the crowd, and so what do? They stick their noses in to find out what's happening. And they're there. And they become part of that mob crowd, and before they know it, they're joining in. But they don't have a clue about what's going on. Do you know that can happen here at church? Do you know that? People come in here because they hear this is the best show in town. Right? They hear that we have the greatest worship team in the city. And so they just show up here and they sing and they cheer. But they don't have a clue what's going on. I think there's another reason that people cheered that day. Is because the word of his miracles had spread. His miracles had spread. This wouldn't have been the first time that crowds had followed Jesus just to see what he was going to do next. You see, a couple years earlier, he had fed 5,000. And after he fed 5,000, they all wanted to follow after him because they wanted to get more food. They just wanted to see what he was going to do next. And I think about that. But I think this Passover, there's a little difference here because John's gospel links a couple events together that make this even more so of let's go see what he's going to do, because John links the raising of Lazarus from the dead to this event of the triumphal entry. So people are coming in because they want to see if Jesus just raised this guy from the dead, what's he going to do next? I want to know what's going to happen. And some cheered because they wanted to see him do it again. Maybe like it happened before. And so some people maybe in that crowd were saying, hey, maybe I can be the subject of the next miracle. Maybe he'll do something for me. So they had the hopes that they could be the object. And so perhaps the cheers were, I picture like this. When I was in first grade and the teachers had a problem on the board and I knew the answer, what did I do? Hey, call on me, because I know the answer. And I can look good giving you that answer. Right? That's kind of what this is like. They're waving their hands and they're shouting, hey, Jesus, look at me. Let me be the next miracle that you perform. But then there's also others that cheered. And I think the heart of this crowd was probably those who had already been touched by Jesus. The Gospels don't tell us, but I got to believe that somewhere in this crowd, probably in the front row, was a guy named Lazarus. Jesus just brought him back to life. You think he forgot about that? No, he wanted to be part of that. Or this guy, Zacchaeus. Jesus ate with him. He knew what Jesus was like, so maybe Zacchaeus wanted to be there. And then there's Mary Magdalene, who experienced Jesus' forgiveness, or Bartimaeus, the blind man. He was from Jericho, the lame man from the pool of Bethsaida. And who knows how many others that Jesus had touched were there in that crowd because they wanted to cheer on their hero. That's why they were there. But I also figure there's some outcasts, some tax collectors, and even lepers that welcomed their friend. Because you see, Jesus had touched so many lives in those 3 years. And at least a few of them, in my mind, would be within that crowd lining that road to Jerusalem. How about you today? Is that why you're here? Because you know what Jesus has done for you, and you want everyone to know how grateful you are, and your worship is all about, as Derek talks every week, your worship is all about celebrating Jesus. I think there are a lot of people that were basically thanking Jesus as they were cheering him as he was going down this road. Now, I got to tell you that if historians are correct, if they've not changed history again, if the historians are correct, a big part of the crowd may have thought that they were inaugurating a new king. You see, most Jews of that day looked forward to the day when God was going to send his heavenly army to liberate Jerusalem from Rome. And the Messiah would lead the way, riding on a great white stallion with his sword up in the air, the sun glistening from it. But I'll tell you what, if that's what they expected, then boy, were they ever in for a surprise. That's probably the point of a young donkey. It was just about as opposite as you could get from a war horse stallion. And if this was the Messiah, he sure wasn't living up to their expectations, was he? But we can make the same mistake today. We can make the same mistake. We often create an image of God that it's what we think he should be. But I'm going to tell you, those imaginary gods that we create, they always take our side. They will condemn other people's sins, but they will never condemn my sins. You see, we create them because we want to solve our imaginary problems. We want them to meet our needs. And maybe that's the side of human nature that explains how quickly we went from Palm Sunday to Good Friday. Human nature went from cheering to mostly jeering. But there was jeering this day too. See, if you listen close, you can hear the jeers in that Sunday crowd. Some in the crowd challenged Jesus to quiet the parade. Listen, they wanted that parade to get quiet, not because it was that loud, but because of what they were saying. They didn't want people claiming Jesus to be the Messiah. So they wanted, shh. You can welcome him in, but you need to be quiet with those words. jealousy, and fear drive opposition to Jesus. You see, the people who were jeering were worried about the rumors of a conquering Messiah that might spark reaction from the Romans. Listen, the high priest later this week would argue in John chapter 11, verse 50, they would argue that you do not realize that this is better for you that one man die for the people than the whole nation perish. That's coming from the priest, coming from religious leaders. And listen, you and I, we cannot often understand why anyone would find fault with Jesus, right? How could anyone not appreciate his message of love your neighbor and be nice to your enemy? Listen, is there anyone out here in this world today that does not want peace on earth and goodwill to men? Those of us who are followers of Jesus, that meek and mild Jesus, sometimes we get very confused by those that are anti-Christian. But maybe the truth is very simply that some of those jeers come from folks who are paying more attention to Jesus than we are. Maybe they know there's more to Jesus than the tiny babe in a manger. They see through the superficial message of kindness and universal tolerance. They understand the implications of take up your cross daily and follow me. Maybe those that are jeering actually understood what Jesus meant when he said, no one gets to the Father except through me. They realized Jesus never left room for any mushy middle ground where all religions are the same and any and all behavior is to be tolerated and never ever come to condemnation. Listen, Jesus may be many things, but just nice, that's not one of them. Maybe some jeered on Sunday because they weren't surprised on Monday. When anything that happened, that didn't happen because of a meek and mild Jesus marched into the temple, because that day he had fire in his eyes. And he turned tables. And he chased money changers. Jesus wasn't just nice. Our text records another revealing moment on this first day of Jesus' last week. And we'll never understand the Passion Week until we talk about the tears. Tears. Suddenly, this parade grinds to a halt. Those in the rear probably wondered what was happening, just like when you're traveling down I-465 and you're going 70 miles an hour, even though the speed limit's not that, you're going 70 miles an hour, and all of a sudden there's a wall of cars in front of you. What in the world just happened? Well, you don't know until you get up to the wreck or until you get up to the construction. You just don't know what happened. Same thing true here. They didn't know what was going on. Jesus just stopped. Maybe it's when he came around the corner that he stopped, or maybe it's when he came into the clearing that he stopped, but there was no reason that they could see. He around that, coming down the winding path, perhaps he came to a clearing in the olive groves and he just stops and he looks at the big city that's spread out before him. You know, even today, the view of Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives is absolutely breathtaking. And so Jesus looks down at the city. He looks at the crowded streets. He sees the busy marketplace. He sees rows and rows of houses. And he could see that magnificent temple in all of its glory. And maybe for a moment, there's some nostalgia that hits him. He thinks back over the centuries of history that has taken place, and in this same spot that he is right now, he's remembering how David and Solomon and Isaiah and Nehemiah, Ezra, all the great heroes of the nation had stood in this same place looking over that great city of Jerusalem. But I think there's a lot more to the tears than just the nostalgia. Jesus knew what happened right there before, but he also knew what was coming. The parade of Palm Sunday was no accident. Jesus knew what he would face by week's end. He had told the disciples that he'd come there to die, that he would be betrayed by a friend, tormented by his foes, and eventually crucified for the sins of the world. But they didn't believe him. They actually argued with him. So I believe, can't prove this by scripture, but I believe that part of his tears were partly over their unbelief. He wept over Jerusalem because they didn't accept the grace that God had offered them. But I think he also wept over these guys he had been with for 3 years, and they still didn't believe him. See, he knew what was going to happen later. That definitely brings tears. Because you see, he sees the end from the beginning. He knows the consequences of the rejection that he's going to face that week. He knows the judgment and destruction that's going to come to the city that has rejected God's grace. I truly believe that he wanted it to turn out differently. If he were the kind of Savior who forced people to follow him, who makes decisions for them, it would have been different. But that's just not the way Jesus works, is it? In our Bible study on Wednesday and Thursday, we have a lady that says it's that dang free will stuff. And that's exactly what it is. It's the free will that we have. Matthew chapter 23, verse 37 says this, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." Let's just be honest. Some of us sitting here today aren't willing to be gathered under the wings either, are we? We still want to live life our way. We want to do things our way. We don't want to do it Jesus' way. There were cheers that day. There were many cheers that day because he came into town. There were some that jeered that day because they didn't like what Jesus represented. And there were tears that day because Jesus knew what was happening, not only to him, but to the people of Jerusalem who rejected him. Is he crying for you today? Is he weeping over you because you've rejected him? Today's an opportunity to change that. I'd love to talk to you about how Jesus can become part of your life and just stop rejecting him. Let him be part of your everyday life.